Recording in progress. Hello, everyone, and welcome to School of Speech, presented by SpeechTherapyPD. I'm your podcast host, Carolyn Dolby, and I am so glad you're tuning in today. Okay, we have a returning guest, one of my favorite people, Dr. Lesley Sylvan is here with us. Today, she is going to be tackling from overwhelmed to empowered, navigating multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, as a school-based SLP. I am super excited about this one. All right, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Sylvan. She is there's Stephen for you. Sorry about that. Dr. Sylvan is an associate professor and the master's degree program director at Montclair State University. As an SLP, Lesley has extensive clinical experience with school-aged children in both public school and in private settings. Lesley obtained her doctorate degree in human development and education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And broadly, Dr. Sylvan's scholarly interests center on the intersection between the field of education and the field of speech-language pathology, right where we need to be today. So, as we start settling in for another amazing episode with an amazing clinician, I do want to remind everyone that each episode of School of Speech is offered for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And if your state license requires live CEUs and you're listening in today, well, thank you. And we want to make sure you get credit. So be sure to complete all the course modules, including the one that says complete course by the end of today. And you'll find all of that on your Speech Therapy PD account. Now, we absolutely love and encourage your questions. And so please use the chat for your questions and comments throughout this podcast. Those listening live, please jump in the chat if you can right now. Let us know where you are listening from. And we want to know if you are planning to implement MTSS this year in your practice. So jump in the chat. Where are you from? And are you planning on implementing MTSS this year? All right, while you guys are all doing that, I have a little bit more housekeeping to do. Let's go through some disclosures. Lesley is a full-time salary professor at Montclair State University. And she is, listen, you guys are in great hands. She is the author of Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Implementation, Tools for Speech-Language Pathologists in Education. It's published by Plural Publishing in 2021, and she is receiving royalties for the sale of this book. Word on the street, she is working on the second edition. I'm going to jump into that in a minute. But she's also receiving an honorarium for this presentation from SpeechTherapyPD. With no non-financials. For me, I am a salaried employee of Portland Public Schools here in Oregon, and I receive compensation from Speech Therapy PD for hosting School of Speech. I have no non-disclosures to disclose today. All right, enough about me. Hi, Lesley, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited that one of my former students is in the chat.
What?
Special
Call her
shout
out.
out to Molly, who said she graduated from Montclair in 2019. So quite
Hi,
a few New Jersey people here. I
Molly.
can't see everyone's names, but really
We
excited to see one of my past students here.
We have a ton of Jersey in the house today.
Yeah.
Oh, I love this. Well, we're right, and a lot of California. Hi, everyone. Oh, we are so glad you guys are here. Super excited. I'm super excited because I fessed up with Lesley before we got started that I am a real novice when it comes to multi-tiered systems. And so I kind of need to start like from the beginning. I mentioned that you wrote the book, but you're also in the middle of writing the second edition of that. And I'm going to put that in I'm going to put the link in the chat in just a minute. But could you just start us off and maybe mostly for me, like just explaining what is MTSS? Like start from the beginning. How is this happening?
Well, I'm happy to start from the beginning. Multi-tiered systems of support is one of my very favorite topics. Could talk about it for weeks. But thank you again for having me. It's great to be back. And thank you for the bio and the overview. And I feel like when you were introducing me and you were talking about the intersection between education and speech language pathology, I feel like That's exactly where my research has been and my work has been. And that's also exactly where multi-tiered systems of support is. So I really came to it because I'm very interested in education. That's what I did my doctorate degree in, but I'm really interested in the role of the speech language
Mhm.
pathologist in education. And MTSS is really all about how SLPs can really be an integral, important, and impactful part of the whole educational process. So sometimes we talk about SLPs, working in silos or working separately or people not understanding our roles. Those are all, lot big issues that we can talk about, but multi-tiered systems of support is really a general education framework. So it's not a speech therapy framework. It's not came up with by speech language pathologists or only implemented by speech language pathologists. It's really a system-wide general education framework that is prevention oriented.
Mm.
And the idea is that we can really be very proactive with education and help students when they start to struggle maybe a little bit or even prevent those struggles from becoming bigger rather than waiting as we maybe have done in other ways, right, for problems to become so big that they necessitate special education and IEPs, right? Those will still be there, but multi-tiered systems of support is really thinking about preventative and proactive framework. And it's not just a framework for speech language pathologists. What I'm most interested in is how can speech language pathologists contribute, but teachers, school psychologists, really anybody in a school can be part of the prevention-oriented proactive framework. So that's a good starting point. And I really, love to think about how SLPs can make the greatest impact that we can in schools, not just on the students we serve, but on all of the students, on the educational system as a whole. And really, that's what MTSS helps us think about how we can do that. So that's a starting point. There's so much more to say.
I know, I know. What is this framework you speak of?
So MTSS stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And the idea, as I've mentioned, there's a couple key parts to it, is that it's prevention oriented. There's a continuum of support. So rather than thinking as sort of a binary way, right, you either get what's offered in the classroom or you are special education and you get really intensive services. There's a continuum of supports. And when we talk about tiers, that talks about the continuum of supports. In general, when we talk about MTSS, we talk about 3 tiers. And
Okay.
tier 1 is the tier of support that everybody in a school gets. So the level of support that might be happening in a classroom, delivered by the teacher and or any other specialist that's available to all students. And the idea is that that's inclusive, that anticipates diverse learning needs, and that meets the needs of most students. But then we know that it won't meet the needs of all students. So then we also have tier 2 and tier 3, which are meant to be additive, right? So students continue to get the level of support in the classroom and tier 1 support and then additional support. So tier 2 would be maybe some small group work, some additional consultation, some extra help or support in key areas that a child may need support with. And then tier 3 would be even more intensive. And for any student, they could be getting support across the tiers in different areas, right? Because students have different strengths. So maybe they would be getting tier 1 support when it comes to social skills, when it comes
Hmm.
to reading, right? That's an area of strength for them, but they need more assistance related to articulation or vocabulary or behavior or other things. So they could be getting different kinds of tiers of support on their needs. And that there is another really important part about MTSS is that it's a very collaborative model. So rather than saying, okay, what the teacher's not doing is not working, maybe now you go and work with the speech language pathologist, that there's collaboration across all of the tiers to support whatever areas of target, and that there is a lot of use of data and evidence-based practice to provide the right levels of instruction or intervention at the varying levels. And it's meant to be much more fluid and adaptable than we think about IEPs, right? You don't say, oh, you have an IEP today, but maybe in 2 weeks, we'll take you off that IEP, kind of see how you're doing, right? And so it's meant to be fluid and adaptable that can kind of change as students' needs change. And sometimes those can change a lot more quickly, right, than sort of maybe like a legal process might allow us to do. So students can kind of move throughout the tiers as their needs change, as they develop. And the idea is to help all of the students sort of reach the common outcome. Sometimes I think about MTSS as like the lanes on the highway that you might drive
Mhm.
towards. And all the students are hoping to get to, like, high school graduation, college readiness, career readiness, but they're going to need different levels of support along the way. And those are kind of what the tiers allow us to do.
So what I'm hearing is like SLPs can be in from starting at tier one.
Absolutely, yes. And ideally, SLPs are involved starting at tier one because, well, MTSS is not like a feeder special education, right? It's not like a referral process. If
Mhm.
we can support students at tier one, maybe less students may need our support at the level of tier three or through special education because we can be supporting them across the tiers and setting them up for success. So being involved with tier one is kind of like the base of the triangle. A lot of times when you talk about MTSS, you may see that triangle where you see the different levels on top, or sometimes I do an upside down triangle because that kind of shows how it's more of like a
Oh.
funnel, like most students
Mhm.
at the top and funneling down. Or you see a pyramid. And in either case, tier one is the base of it, right? So without a good tier one at the bottom, all the other levels sort of don't make sense, right? Like, how do
Mhm.
we know that they need something additional? We want to make sure they have the strong tier one foundation. And a lot of people are familiar or have heard of response to intervention, which is sort of part of this MTSS framework. And the idea is that we want to see how students are doing and if they need more support by how they've responded to interventions. And we also want to know how they've responded to high quality instruction, right? If a child is struggling to read, for example, we found out, just to make a really simple example, no one ever taught them to read, right? Then it isn't that they have a reading disability, right? It's that we needed a higher quality tier one support. That's just an extreme example, right? But if someone is struggling, we may not know if it's because they didn't get that instruction that they needed, or perhaps it's because there's another reason. So without that
Mhm.
tier one, it's really hard to make those decisions. And so that's why tier one is so
I think
important.
it'd be I'm sorry, the thing that came into my head, it kind of made me giggle. I thought, I'm not sure any teacher's gonna be like, I think it's because I've given poor instruction.
Right, of course not. Of
Like, I
course
don't
not.
see that coming out.
Yeah. But we may say, look, this student didn't go to preschool, right? So they
Right,
haven't had
no,
a
yeah.
chance.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe this student is learning English, right? And we don't need to move straight towards maybe a special education evaluation. It's never really like a judgment of like an SLP is going to come in and say, hey, what's happening in the classroom?
Mm-hmm.
But can we enhance? Can we leverage our knowledge and expertise related to language and communication to make sure that all students are getting that really strong foundation?
That kind of leads into like being torn between like what is our responsibility as an SLP? Um, between like how involved in MTSS should we be? Can we be when we have so many IEP responsibilities?
Mhm.
That's how do oh, that gets us to that balancing. How do we balance that?
And that, I think, is the million-dollar question, right? And a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about because I think that when most SLPs start to hear about contributing at the tier one level and supporting the whole school system, it sounds amazing philosophically, right? Like we're all in this field because we want to see all students succeed. We'd love to be part of that. But then our mind starts turning, what?
Like,
You're
how can we
expecting me to
possibly
do
do
this
this?
on top of what I'm
Yeah.
already doing. And we know how unrealistic it is to just say, well, just add one more thing, right, to your plate. SLPs feel like they've already got a very full plate. And so, how do we think about MTSS in terms of all of the responsibilities that we have on our plate, especially IEPs, right? IEPs in some ways is our bread and butter, right? Like things
Right.
that we
Those are
absolutely must do.
those are our mandated minutes. That's what
Exactly.
we're right. That's why
Exactly.
we're here. Yeah.
Right. So I got so interested in this question that I actually did an entire study about, I went to a school district and I worked with a whole team of SLPs, did focus groups, did individual interviews with SLPs over the course of a whole year, really trying to see how do SLPs try to think about this balance? And what's the best metaphor or what's the most best way to kind of think about that? So I could start jumping into a little bit about that study if you want to, or if you want to talk a little bit more about the basics of MTSS. I'm happy to talk about that study because I think you're right. That's where people's mind goes straight towards. And I think that
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways to think about it rather than an additive responsibility, really integrated and closely related to our responsibilities related to IEPs. Instead of thinking about them as two like separate sides of a coin, they're sort
Mhm.
of the coin all together. And so thinking about this as just one more thing to add to your plate, I think is probably the worst way to think about it because it just immediately makes you feel like, well, I already feel like I have more than full time, right? So thinking
Yeah.
about how to integrating it into making you more successful and more impactful with students with IEPs, with our work that is really central to who we are in as SLPs, and how that can kind of support that work and perhaps even make it more impactful or more effective as well.
I love it. Well, I'm going to do a shout out to Kathy because she gave an example. She added that she was able to go into pre-KK general ed classrooms for
Mhm.
45 minutes a day. There were three at one school and two at another. Oh, wow, you were doing this big time. She took her guitar. I love everything about this.
I love
She did
that.
language and speech, whole group lessons, no referrals that year.
So thank you, Kathy. That's an amazing story. And it sounds like an amazing program, especially with your guitar. And it kind of nicely encapsulates the idea that I'm trying to get is she was able to do what sounds like some prevention-oriented work, really supporting the speech and language of that whole group. And the work that she did there may have stopped her from doing a whole lot of work later, right?
Hmm.
Maybe there would be some referrals that came from that classroom where maybe there wasn't the extra language stimulation that all of those kids got. And then she would maybe be doing evaluations, parent meetings, developing IEPs, doing, intervention groups. So it's kind of like an ounce of prevention is better than a
Hmm.
pound of remediation, right?
That is
And that
exactly
doesn't,
what.
mean that we don't expect that some students will sometimes go on and need referrals, right? This isn't a way to eliminate special education, but when we think about for some students, could have there been something that we could have given them earlier or in the classroom? And this sounds like this was a really inclusive, universal level of support, right? Students weren't singled out. Everybody was getting it. It was enhancing the general education classroom. And then it may have saved some work later. And then Kathy also added, thank you, Kathy, for really helping me. The teachers loved it. And then the teachers, guess what, probably saw it, even when Kathy wasn't in that classroom, may have been continuing to
Mhm.
do some of the strategies. So I like to talk about this concept of collective efficacy, right? We all
Ooh.
feel like we're responsible in schools for students' speech and language skills, right? It's not that it's, Kathy's job, Lesley's job, Carolyn's job.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
I'm the teacher, I don't do this. These are all of our students, and everybody in the school can be supporting speech and language because we don't want to be the only ones, and we know there's lots of research, right, that anything we can do twice a week for 30 minutes, even twice a week for an hour, right, which would be a ton, isn't as much as there could be support for it throughout the whole
The
day.
whole day. Oh,
When teachers can see what SLPs are doing and we can really work together, then they can also incorporate that across the day for all of their students, helping all of them. So it's a great example of how that tier one support can in some ways not just help teachers and students, but help SLPs because they're not the only ones out there now supporting speech and language skills.
two things popped in my head while you were talking. The first one is when you were talking about, I love when you were saying that we're help not to think of ourselves as just special ed or just these kids. Like we are part of the school community. And
Mhm.
because I was just talking the other day how it's frustrating in some campuses that if you are in special ed, you're no longer considered general ed.
Mhm.
And we forget that every single child is general ed with special ed support.
Right.
And if you take that framework, this works right into that.
Absolutely. This relates to that idea very closely, right? Every student is a general education
Yes.
student first. And every student that gets special education services, those are meant to help them access and be participate in the general education curriculum. So it is our business and it's our expertise, right? To help students be successful in education. That's what we're there for, right? That's what we're there for in schools. And so when we can understand what's happening in the classroom, what their goals are, be part of that, partner with the teachers and say, these are all of our kids, right? It's not like these are your kids, these are my kids. These are all of our kids. And how can we support all of their speech and language skills? And then we can really reserve our time for the students that only need our individual, like they need that individual support from us. And that's the only way that they can really make progress, right? We have the tier 2 and tier 3 level, but there's not any students in the school, no matter how well they're doing, right, that can't benefit from
Right.
additional speech and language support. And in doing so, getting the idea of that students are general education students first, we also want to support students in the least restrictive environment that we can.
Absolutely.
So the more we can enhance what's happening at the tier 1 level for them, that's the way for them to get that speech and language support in an inclusive manner as well. So concepts like inclusion, universal design for learning, least restrictive environment, those are all closely related to MTSS and how it's implemented as well.
So when back in the day, like over 25 years ago, at a district that I worked with in Texas, they don't do this anymore. But their early childhood ECSE, so early childhood special education. So it was for your 3 to 5 year olds,
Mhm.
self-contained classrooms. So it was called ECSE. I think it's still called ECSE. When it was rolled out in that district that I was with, the teachers were had to be speech pathologists. They were both a teacher and a speech. The whole classroom was basically speech all day.
Mhm.
They don't do that anymore. I'm not sure why, but and that was I hadn't thought about that in forever until we started talking. I was like, oh my gosh, that's kind of like, wouldn't that be amazing if we could be in the classroom all day long?
Amazing. And in some ways, although, we can't,
No, we can't.
we can partner with our teachers
Hmm.
and they can be supporting speech and language skills throughout the day too, because speech and language and communication we know is so closely related to academic success, right? It's not
Right.
like it's something that's over here and teachers are like, I'm sorry, I don't have time to work on that. They want to work, right?
Hmm.
On speech and language and communication because it's so closely embedded. So, I mean, I think that sounds like an amazing model. And
Yeah.
some SLPs that really embrace MTSS, MTSS is not the same as like push-in services or, only inclusive services, but it can be very closely related. It can sometimes prompt SLPs to spend more of their time in the classroom and delivering services in the classroom. And in some ways, by being in the classroom more, even if you're not there all day, it begins to have some of that effect, right? Where people are seeing how speech and language is embedded right into the classroom and teacher aides, even other students can learn ways to help support language for themselves and for their peers. And it really can kind of become part of the school classroom culture or school culture related to communication and language.
I want to make sure I'm not sure if I heard this right or not. Did you say that it's not push in?
So MTSS is not synonymous with push-in. MTSS can look in lots of different ways. So MTSS can look like professional development for teachers. It
Hmm.
can look like pull-out sessions for students that don't have IEPs, but that are like short-term intervention sessions. It can look like push-in services. It can look like 5-minute pullouts. It can look like modeling. So there's lots of different ways to quote unquote do MTSS or implement MTSS. One thing that I've sometimes heard is like a pushback from people that are interested in MTSS is they might say, well, I like the idea of MTSS, but I don't like the idea of doing all of my services as push-in. And I might say that embracing MTSS does not mean that all services are push-in, right? It may mean that you may feel like the model that you're using brings you to spend more time in the classroom, but it doesn't dictate that, right? It doesn't mean every single student on our caseload, we will work with them in the classroom now because
Mhm.
that's what MTSS means, right? And so that's, I think it's important to kind of clarify what MTSS is and what it isn't, because that can sometimes be a barrier when people think about MTSS, like, oh, it is one more thing that I have to do, or it means that all my services are push-in, or it means that I have to always be in the classroom, right? So sometimes I like to mention what it is and what it isn't too, just to kind of for clarity. Does that make sense?
Um, yes, but
Good.
I no, again, like I am a novice in this, so I do have a lot of questions on this because when you said that you might pull students for like 5 minutes of intervention, but if they haven't, how does that work if you were a special educator? How can you be pulling a student that's not been identified? Work me through that.
So it's a good question. And it does vary based on different contexts and different, like, district or state rules. So anybody who's listening can kind of think about how this might apply. However, there can be situations, and one really great example of this is, has anybody or have you heard of the speech improvement class? Or
Mm-mm.
so the speech improvement class is an example of a multi-tiered approach to supporting students' articulation skills. This particular speech improvement class that I'm going to talk about came out of the work of Jennifer Taps Richard in San Diego Unified School District. I think I saw a couple San Diego people out there, so that's why I thought I
Mm.
might mention it, but has also been implemented in other districts. So in that particular district, and I've talked quite a bit to Jennifer Taps Richard and featured in my book, so I'll tell you a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
her work. She's another great person to talk to. They noticed that a lot of students that had some either single sound errors or maybe two sound errors, common sound errors, tended to linger for a long time on special education caseloads. And that was starting to be a challenge. That's a challenge that a lot of school districts face, right? Is this the best model for working with students with single sound errors, or what we might call minor articulation deficits? Because once they get into IEPs, maybe they're there for years, maybe getting, services that are half an hour a week, 40 minutes a week, not necessarily supporting their progress as rapidly as they could. So they decided, what if we used a different approach, a speech improvement class, and we would identify students and say, look, this is a student who actually maybe doesn't qualify for having an IEP, right? Maybe their articulation deficits aren't impeding their progress in the classroom. We have to think about all the eligibility criteria,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or the IEP model isn't serving their needs because maybe they're not making the progress that we would like to see them see in the expected time frame. So they implemented a model where they worked with students and they had a certain way of identifying which students would be candidates for that. Generally, students over the age of 7 that had either one or two common sounds in error. And then they, with parent permission, pulled
Okay.
them out for a short period of time. And they had a specific schedule that they followed, and they did an intervention cycle that was 6 or 8 weeks. And then they would see which students made enough progress during that time period that that was all they needed. And they actually found remarkably that a lot of students, all they needed was a shortened, a set time period. And I'm saying 6 to 8 weeks. I'd have to
Mhm.
look at the details of her model
Sure.
because this has been implemented in different places. And they would say, look, I did this for 15 students, and 12 of them made enough progress in 6 weeks that they don't need any other intervention. But maybe three of them, they still are continuing to really struggle, right? And maybe those are the students now that we go on to develop an IEP for. But look, here were these 12 students. Instead of developing an IEP, doing a full assessment, having a parent meeting,
Mm-hmm.
working with them for at least a year, right? Because usually when someone has an IEP, they would stay on it for
Mm-hmm.
at least a
Yes, they
year, maybe
do.
more.
Yeah.
And then, having a dismissal meeting, look, we were able to help them make progress with their articulation in a short period of time using a intensive. Some people do it for a certain duration of time with a group. Some people have implemented this with 5-minute sessions. There's a lot of different districts have tried different things. And then they made the progress that they needed, and then they were done, right? There wasn't any paperwork or extensive paperwork related to
Mm-hmm.
IEPs, and they were able to make that progress. And those students didn't end up on caseloads and with that associated work. So that would be an example of a tiered approach to articulation that
Mm-hmm.
didn't happen in the classroom. And, in that particular district, they have a very robust set of, parent permission forms and information forms and homework packets. But other districts have come up with very similar models, or, based on that model where they've supported articulation skills or other kinds of language skills. And then it gets to be a really great source of data too, because let's say you work with a student for 6 to 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Then some students may make the progress that they need. They don't end up on the caseload. And if not, you have a very rich set of data that can really help you make a informed case for what kinds of support that they do need moving forward from that.
I love that. When our first thing when we're looking at for a referral, like what are the interventions that have been done?
Mhm.
It does make sense that we have a hand in those interventions.
Right,
I just had that
right,
light bulb on that. That's what that's all about is we want an intervention. We don't want to identify students unless they're truly with a disability.
right.
Right. And so, and a lot of times, like, especially with articulation, we can make a case to get them on our caseload for, depending on what district you're in, for one sound. But this whole thing with getting them in, getting them out without having it become, uh, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm even saying that right, but
Without identifying them as a student
yeah.
with a disability. And with that, there's legal issues, right? We want to make sure we're really only identifying students that have a disability as having an IEP. But we also want to use our time and our students' time efficiently, right? If a
Mhm.
student can benefit from a short-term intervention and that's all they need, that's much more efficient for them and allows them to then be part of the classroom, continue with their, education and being with their peers. So being efficient for students is supportive of their education. And we're talking about this balancing act, right? It's also supportive of our time. The amount of time that we may invest in that is going to be much more efficient than identifying those students, doing all of the paperwork that's associated with it, bringing them into groups
Mhm.
where maybe they are with mixed groups, maybe they are not necessarily getting um, the same rapid progress that we might see using a different model that's kind of designed for that purpose. And that's exactly, there's been quite a few studies that have looked at how that's been implemented. Different districts, because of their different contexts, maybe different state rules, have implemented this in slightly different ways. But the main idea of short-term interventions outside of the classroom, but also outside of the IEP progress, and have seen really, really valuable outcomes from it.
So, kind of two comments have come in already. Michelle indicated she said that she's a daughter that has benefited from being in part of a friendship group. It was sort of a pre-504. Oh, so interesting. I
Mhm.
like that. And with the counselor. So that does sound similar, and that sounds really doable.
Mhm.
But then we've got, thank you, Kim, for kind of saying what dealing with a district in Georgia that their SPED department indicated that they couldn't do that. They had to stop seeing students that were not already identified. Oh, that is disappointing.
It is disappointing. And, sometimes part of that can be different variations in state rules or district rules. But I also think it's potentially, I don't know anything, Kim, about your specific situation, but thank you very much for sharing
Yeah.
an opportunity for
Budget.
some, well, also, some advocacy is what I was going to say,
Oh,
because as
okay.
much as we may, as SLPs, don't know as much as we can, right, about MTSS. Sometimes school administrators don't either, right? And they may say, hey, this doesn't look like what I learned. that special education specialists do. This is not what we're going to do. And sometimes that's the end, right? But
Mhm.
sometimes we might say, well, we know that relying on norm reference standardized tests, right, is not a good way to, it's not culturally sensitive. There's issues with psychometrics, right, of the only kinds of data. And could make a case to say this allows us to really make solid legal eligibility decisions. And no one says that we can't participate in the assessment process, right? And so
Mhm.
some SLPs that I've talked to have been able to get back. And yes, sometimes it can be litigation. Sometimes it's just a hard no, right? Like I'm not saying this works in every single case, but the idea of saying, look, this is a way for us to gather data. Let's think about this as part of the process of gathering data to make educational decisions can sometimes be useful. But special education and budgets and special education can be really complicated. And sometimes there are particular places, especially when there's litigation involved, as I think Kim just mentioned in the
Mhm.
chat, where you can reach certain walls. And then I'm seeing someone saying we use it as an RTI, but then it's always, worth revisiting over time, right? Even if it's a no last year, things change, new leadership comes, and there is in federal policy, which I'll talk about because that
Mhm.
applies to most people, IDEA does say that we don't have to rely only on standardized tests for making eligibility decisions, and that we should be looking at how students respond to intervention. So I'm seeing again RTI
Mhm.
coming up as a more valid way of looking and making eligibility decisions. And IDA also highlights that funds that are sort of earmarked for special education can be used in those prevention-oriented services when we're trying to see how students are responding to interventions as part of making good decisions. And
Mhm.
so there are parts of federal policy. The Every Student Succeed Act also highlights multi-tiered systems of support as something that's beneficial to both special education students and non-special education students. And so there are some levers and parts of
Mhm.
policy that we can point to, but I can't promise this is a panacea, right? Like when litigation is involved and different districts, different leadership, it's very important to make sure that you're sort of aligned with that when you're implementing MTSS as
I
well.
mean, I mean, I guess I could kind of see if they're saying, well, with child find, if we suspect a disability, we need to test for that disability.
Hmm.
But I think if you flip it around and say this is actually us getting the data and doing intervention before, as part of that process, we're not doing this in lieu of providing special
Hmm.
education. This is to make it a more robust evaluation, or look at each child. I could see it like that. Um, oh, I had another thought, but now it's just gone.
Right. And we
Oh,
never want to use multi-tiered systems of support as a way to delay inappropriate
no,
evaluation, right?
exactly.
And so
Yes.
it's not like an either or.
Or.
Like we definitely want to do appropriate evaluations. And for some students, gathering information about how they're responding to different tiers of support, because getting back to those concepts of inclusion, which is
Mm-hmm.
very important, right? Taking about least restrictive environment and that all students are general education students first, right?
First. Yes.
These are all the things that can kind of lead to support for that. But nothing about MTSS says like we're going to neglect to do appropriate evaluations or identify students. In some ways, there are parallel ideas, right? We have MTSS
Mm-hmm.
and we have special education. MTSS is not meant to push out special education, right? It's meant to make it more efficient and effective. And also, how about the students who struggle? And we all know those students as
Yes, we
SLPs, right?
do.
And we know that they are not eligible as students with disabilities, right? An IEP is not legally the right mechanism for them.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can feel so frustrating, right? Because it can feel like a all or nothing, right? Like either they qualify and have an IEP and they can get these services, or they have nothing, right? And that's kind of like it's very binary. And for many years when I worked in schools, I felt like it was kind of like that, right? Like either I identify you and you're going to be part of my caseload and I'm going to work with you and I'm going to follow you over
Mhm.
time, or I'm going to say I didn't find anything and I'm never going to see you again. When we say that, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some challenges that that child was facing, right?
Right,
We wouldn't have been
right.
evaluating them in the first place. We may validly say the student doesn't qualify for an IEP, but we could still help them, right? We still care about all of those kids.
Mm-hmm.
And MTSS gives us an option. It doesn't mean we have to do it all ourselves. It just means that there are ways for us to help them. And we might say, here's what could be happening in the classroom. Here's what we could be doing, these are some interventions that could be done in the classroom. Here are some things I might go do in the classroom for all the students that this kid particularly is going to benefit from. And so it's a way for us to think about being able to extend our expertise to all of those students. And sometimes we all know eligibility decisions can be challenging, right?
Yes.
It can be an extra tool where we never want to be pressured or pushed anyway, but we may think it's hard when we think it's an all or nothing proposition, but we may say, I'm not going to work with a student in an IEP, but I do see them as a tier two student, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could benefit from some. And here's how, as a school team, we're going to support them at that level, right? And so it's another sort of tool in our toolkit of ways that we can support student speech and language skills.
I also heard early on you said that MTSS could also look like teacher PD, provide
Mhm.
training teachers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is another way that we can almost be, when we're training teachers, that can benefit a whole group of students, from our
Mm-hmm.
students with IEPs to students without IEPs that maybe even don't come across our desk, right? Or our radar, but that teachers are thinking about. So doing teacher professional development on a whole range of topics, right? And it would depend what you would want to focus on based on the needs of the school, what the teachers are interested in, what maybe they have knowledge in or want more knowledge in, right? So you'd want it to be very responsive to the needs of the community that you're working in. But MTSS engagement with MTSS can definitely look like professional development and really empowering teachers to be able to support all the different areas the speech and language pathologists work with, sharing some of the knowledge and ideas that we have, and then those can then be implemented across the different tiers as well. So I think that that's a really valuable and doable way. And in that study, which I wanted to come back to a
Oh
little
yeah,
bit
yay!
because
Let's come
time
back
is
to that.
flying
Yes.
by, um, some of the SLPs that I followed and that felt like they were really able to engage in MTSS said they actually felt like it made their work with students with IEPs more manageable because teachers were doing some of the supporting of those students too, because they spent more time talking to teachers, whether in the classroom or in professional development, or maybe in consultation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about individual students. And then those teachers were like, yeah, I know they had their session with you, but guess what? I did the same thing with them when we were in social studies class today. You mentioned that this is something that's really helpful, and I did that too. And they were able to see students make greater progress because even though they have an IEP, they were being supported at the tier one level and the tier two level and through an IEP, right? So they weren't just getting the 30 minutes a week with the SLP, they were getting language skills supported across their day, across different classes. And so the SLPs that I've talked to, both in this study and otherwise, that feel like they've been able to be most successful with MTSS have felt like their motivation for
Mm-hmm.
MTSS was inextricably linked with IEPs, right? It wasn't like it was additive. Like we have IEPs and we have MTSS. I like to sort of think about it as more of like a Venn diagram, right?
Mm-hmm.
Engaging in MTSS helped them with managing IEPs, referrals, assessments, and doing the IEPs also helped them with doing MTSS because they felt like they were able to, as they were supporting their students and they were talking to teachers, they're doing inclusive services, as they were
Yeah.
talking about certain things, they were able to also say, and this could work for everybody, by the way. So many of the interventions that we do for students are targeted to the individual students, but there's for every student that could benefit from them, there's so many more, right, in the classroom. Let's say we're working on graphic organizers. Maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
designed for a specific student. But then if a teacher learns about them and they're like, oh, I did graphic organizers for the whole class, and everybody ended up benefiting from them. So really thinking
Yes.
about those two things is inextricably linked.
I love that. And I was having a conversation with a gal, her name's Vicky Haddix, and she was writing about universal design learning. And she made a comment about how, like in secondary, math and science teachers might not have training on language, right?
Absolutely.
And incorporating that and of course in math and science there's so much communication, so much language. It's language rich to understand. I see that kind of dovetailing there too.
Absolutely. And I saw in the chat a really great story that I wanted to I think her name is Melissa, and she was mentioning how she did RTI but then had to stop doing that. But then SLPs got involved with advocacy, educating, and providing evidence to support RTI, and their SELPA agreed to give the district administrators a choice, and our admin agreed, and we're implementing it this year after 3 years of working to bring it back. That is an amazing
Woohoo!
story. Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like advocacy and leadership and education about what is the role of an SLP in schools, why is it important to have tiered systems of support for supporting all students, for getting great data, for building the collective efficacy of all educators. That's such an amazing success story. So congratulations. And I
That
feel like a
is.
lot of times when MTSS is really successful, there's a SLP behind it that is really advocating and doing an amazing job talking at the district level, at the leadership level to get those ideas off the ground. So there's a lot of components to what MTSS can look like, but I think advocacy is a big one and leadership. So that's a great story.
Thank you. Yes, I love it. Um, so I guess when I just love hearing how to, like, what are some ideas of implementing? Like, what are some strategies? What could we help me know? Like, where should I start? I want to start. How do I start?
How do you start? How
That's a
do I
big ask. That's
start
a
to
big
answer?
ask.
I would say the place to start is thinking about your school,
Mm-hmm.
its needs, your community, right? Because really every school is different and every context is different. And thinking about where could I contribute at the tier one level here? What have I noticed? What could I do? Sometimes that has to do with something that you've noticed through your students, through conversations. Sometimes that has to do with relationships that you have with the different people in the school, right? Like a couple people in the chat have mentioned, close relationships with kindergarten teachers or
Mm-hmm.
certain classrooms, and then thinking, I'm going to start with one thing. I'm going to start small and I'm going to build from there because just like other areas, success brings more success, right? And
Mm-hmm.
starting with something that you're excited about and interested in and that you see a need for, I think is the great jumping off point because once you've had, that's another thing I found in my study is that people that have had a little bit of success with this get hooked and want to do more and more and more. But sometimes when people think, you know what, I'm going to take on all of it, I'm going to do every function possible within an MTSS, that can feel overwhelming and lead to burnout and feeling like this is just, not for me. So I think that the first thing is to think about decision making and where can I make a meaningful difference at the tier one level and or is there a tiered framework already happening at the district? Because a lot of times when people think about support for reading or for math particularly, there may be a district-wide, almost every state has its own, like New Jersey has like the New Jersey tiered framework, the Oregon tiered framework, right? And so tiered supports are everywhere in education, but sometimes SLPs are left out of them. And so finding out what's happening at your school or in your district with tiered support and thinking about how can I get involved and contribute to that. Another really important way to think about getting involved. There's so many ideas. I've written a whole book about it, so I'm trying to think where to start. Is one thing we haven't talked much about is universal screening for speech and language. And
Hmm.
being involved with universal screening is a really valuable way of being involved with MTSS too, because it allows us to identify students that may be at risk, but wouldn't necessarily be flagged in any other way, right? From teachers noticing, and they may benefit very much from some early support related to speech and language. And if we can catch and work with these students earlier, we can give them the support they need in a much more efficient way than waiting until maybe they get to third or fourth grade and then
Where,
really start to see those struggles come up. And of
yes.
course, we can still help, but some of those years have gone by, right, where we could have
Hmm.
been providing intervention. And where there's a lot of universal screening for vision, for hearing, even for decoding, there is less of a practice of universal screening for speech and language skills, like oral language. And that I think is a really important way to jump into MTSS too, is if there isn't already implementing in some way, shape, or form. And I could talk about this a lot more
I love
extensively too.
this.
There's so many things. Universal
Yes.
language. And then thinking about the students that the universal screening reveals potentially to be at risk, what are interventions that we could do for them? And you mentioned the book that I wrote about MTSS, which covers intervention ideas. It has a toolkit of different intervention ideas across all of the English language arts Common Core state standards. So that's speaking and listening, reading, writing, and language. And it also talks about speech sound disorders. So that's articulation, fluency, and voice. And for the new edition, there's a whole chapter about the relevancy of MTSS to alternative and augmentative communication. So many
Oh,
amazing
wow.
examples I could
I,
get
I
into.
did put that in the chat, the link to your
Yeah.
book, and that's the one that's out now. But just so you know, heads up, she's working on the second edition she was just mentioning, that's going to add AAC to that.
Hmm.
That is phenomenal. That's a
I'm
great
so
resource.
excited about that chapter. So many
Yay.
ideas related to AAC.
So I just want to, another idea, Benji, one of our listeners, wrote in, and the speech team at their high school used to offer a voluntary social skills meetup during lunch once a week, and it was administered by the SLP, but it was open to special ed, general ed, it was just open. And they think it was a great, and they would love to bring it back if we could balance my schedule accordingly. That's the thing. I know. We're getting back to balance.
So, it's kind of like one of these things where once we start implementing MTSS and we do it well, we may start to see some of the students that really identify as needing to be on our caseload, hopefully, right, decrease. But it's kind of like that's the long-term goal, but then the short-term reality can sometimes catch up with that. And, one thing that I might encourage you to think about, and maybe you have, Benji, I'm not sure, is, ways that you can think about maybe there's a social skills group where it involves, it's administered by SLPs. And for some students, that counts as some of their minutes, right? They're participating in
Yes.
that. And then other students are involved as volunteers or as general education students. And it's kind of like a way of not multitasking in a negative way, but in a positive way, right? When you are able to deliver services in an inclusive way, right? Maybe the services that you're delivering for students that have identified IEPs is this social skill group or is in the classroom. Then you are both doing your IEPs and you're doing MTSS at the same time, right? And that's kind of
Hmm.
like a sweet spot where we can start to see the balance. I'll never, sort of take away from that challenge, right? School-based SLPs always have too much to do. But the
Always.
idea of MTSS is hopefully thinking of ways that it can actually save us time, help us be more efficient and collaborative, and sometimes being able to multitask by both meeting the needs of our students with IEPs and being
And
inclusive by involving other students at the exact same time. right? Because there isn't,
Yes.
we can do push-in services or creative service delivery. Service delivery doesn't have to look like just taking those students out and working with only them and not
Hmm.
involving anybody else. So thank you for sharing that, though. It sounds like a great example.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that made it easier for me to kind of stomach the thought of like, okay, I'm not only am I'm getting the minutes with my kids on an IEP,
Mhm.
but I'm also able, like, I like this, I like to like multitask. You know,
Mhm.
I like to be able, let's get it all in together. It's not, I like the way you're saying this is always collaborative. It's not one or the other. It's all inclusive. And again, there's the other buzzword you said, inclusivity. You know, we need inclusion. Um, uh, I mean, and then the other point you made, which I think is really true, when you said that, you know, if you start small and you're successful, you're more apt to do it again. And that
Right.
made me think of like a New Year's resolution when you say, I am going to go to the gym 5 days a week and I am gonna, you know, and I'm gonna stop eating ice cream or whatever. And that's gonna fail. You know, you've bitten off too much more than you can chew. But when you start small and you are successful, you are good. Everyone wants to do what they're good at.
Right.
You know,
And
that's
I feel like that success leads to more success because other people
yes.
see it too. So, as an example, I've heard some people say, this year, my kindergarten students that are working on language skills, I'm going to do their services as part of center time, right? I'm going to bring them to the
Mm-hmm.
classroom. I'm going to do that. I know the kindergarten teacher. We've worked together. That's what we're going to do. And then, by the way, I'm going to bring into the classroom other kindergarten students that are on my caseload to join us for that period of time. So I'm going to be meeting those students' needs. But
Mm-hmm.
then I'm also going to have other students be part of that group, and some kids will rotate through. And then they're like, wow, that was so successful, right? Like it worked really well for those kids. Those families were happy. The teacher was happy. So maybe next year I'll do it in kindergarten and first grade too, right? And so not MTSS can feel like a lot. I know I have
Yeah.
so many ideas about this. I didn't even get to talk about all of them, but I've written about them. So you can go find it. But thinking about something that resonates with you, there's a lot of great ideas in the chat, ideas that came up here, and thinking that's what I'm going to do this year. That's what I'm going to start with. And so many SLPs I've talked to, I have in my book, I think almost 50 real world stories of SLPs that either reached out to me or I found them and they shared their successes, kind of like these little ideas that we see in the chat, but a little bit more built out, built into the book. And they will say, once I started doing this, I was hooked and I wanted to do
Mm-hmm.
more and more. And I felt like it was helping me be more successful as a school-based SLP. And that's where you really want to feel. You don't want to feel like I started doing this and it made me feel like I was drowning even more. Those people, it's kind of like a negative loop, right? So you want to get yourself on that positive spiral. And when you feel like you're really doing inclusive services, you're collaborating,
Mm-hmm.
whole school team is working together to support speech and language, it feels great as a school-based SLP, right? You really feel like you're making a difference for the students on your caseload, you're taking care of them, and you're extending and leveraging your expertise to help all of the students in the school make progress. And that's a great place to be.
I love bridging the we are school-based SLPs. I love bridging that we're here, we work in the schools. We should be working in the schools. We should be working with the students. I think that that's sort of like a light bulb for me that again, because again, we always hear, oh, we are siloed. We don't, you know, but this is a way to really have higher visibility.
Absolutely. And Julia, I just thought ask a quick question. What I meant in that example is that maybe you're going into a kindergarten classroom. Maybe you have, I don't know, 6 kindergarten students. 4 of them are in that classroom. You pull the other 2 that are on your caseload too and bring them with you into that classroom. That way you don't leave anybody out and you're doing the inclusive services. That's what I meant. And maybe next week you go into their classroom. So I just wanted to answer that question
Oh,
too.
wait, are
Hopefully
you
that
saying
helped.
that like if you were going into a classroom, you could bring like a kinder classroom, you had two in an IEP in another class and bring them with
You
you?
could
So,
bring, I've heard of students, people doing that. You don't
yeah.
have to.
Well,
It's
no,
just
I
an
mean,
option.
wow.
There's so many creative ways to think about meeting the needs of our students. And that is just a small example that somebody
Mhm.
shared with me, right, is that they were going to be, they said they were going to do their kindergarten groups. There were maybe 3 or 4 kindergarten classrooms in the school year. So they were going to spend 6 weeks in each one, right, rotating
Mhm.
around. But they were going to bring all of their IEP kids with them every time because that was part of their service delivery.
Oh, I
So the
got
weeks
it.
that they were in, kindergarten A, those kids were already there. And they just grabbed the kiddos from B and C and said, field trip, right? We're going to be in
How
classroom A
fun
for this
is,
half an hour. And then the next 6 weeks, they were in the other classroom. None of these ideas, I don't think there's any MTSS cookbook, right? Just like
yeah.
there's not any speech. So this is just a thought that someone shared with me that they did. And they actually said it was pretty fun, right? Because they got to meet the needs of the students on their caseload. They did some of the services in the classroom, sometimes as a whole group lesson, sometimes they had centers, sometimes they had other kids joining that group. There was a lot of different ways that they did it. And that the kids got to benefit from seeing those lessons multiple times, some kids, because they'd see it in another classroom, in
Mhm.
their classroom. So there's lots of possible creative approaches. And you're right, for some of those kids, it's still pulling them out of class, but then they also have the weeks where they're going to be in their class, right? So services don't have to be either strictly pull out or push in, right? They could look like a lot of different things. And
Mhm.
one thing I like about MTSS is it gets us kind of creative, right? Thinking outside the box. How can we leverage our expertise to help as many students as we can, while inclusively and proactively supporting the needs of the students on our caseload? And there can be some really creative ideas that I've heard of what people have come up with to try to
And
make that happen.
yeah, Krista asked, would this include doing like, would MTSS be part of like if you're doing a large group session in the classroom? Would
It could be a large group
could
session where you do
okay.
something that's a large group session and those kids are present, or it could be something that's like a small group that kids rotate around to, or it could be a combination, right?
Okay.
But yes, I think in this particular case, this could be like a really language rich, kind of like I think we saw earlier with the guitar and
Yes.
language group, right? Maybe that's for that whole classroom, but you pull in some more kiddos to benefit from that. And then maybe you reinforce that same lesson before or after in a smaller group. So there's not just one way of doing it. There could be a lot of possibilities depending on what you're targeting and what the needs of the kids that you're working with are.
Oh my gosh, I just had a wonder. It was when you said to like the kids, IEP kids, maybe you're working with the IEP the kids that are on your IEPs on a, let's say, on a concept,
Mhm.
right? And then because you know that's coming up in the classroom, then you go into the classroom, they're already successful, and you're bringing in other kids. Am I making sense?
Absolutely, that
Okay,
makes
I was
sense.
just like,
So maybe
oh my
you're
gosh.
working on a concept, or maybe you're working on narratives and story
Yeah,
retells, right?
yes.
Maybe you've previewed that story with them. You've read it in a small group with those 6 kids. And now you read it to the whole class, but those 6 kids are there. And you
Mm-hmm.
say, who can answer this question? Who can tell me this story? Who's going to raise their hand the first? Those kids, they've heard it, right? And then they get the practice with oral speaking in the classroom, story retell, maybe WH
Yes.
questions. There's a lot of things that you may be working on, and their session may look different days. One day it is a lesson in the whole classroom, and you've talked to them before. You said
Mm-hmm.
yesterday, I'm going to come, I'm going to read this whole story to your whole class, and I'm going to ask you, what happens next? And, or, what do we learn from the story? Whatever it is that you're
Yeah.
working. And then those kids, that's a huge reinforcement, right? To be able to think, when we think about generalization and some of the drawbacks, right, of pull out, sort of decontextualized services, this gets you really thinking about how does this apply? And it makes the connection for the kids too, right? Yesterday I practiced this with you, and today I'm doing it in the classroom.
Yeah, now
So
I'm doing it in real life. Like I'm applying what I learned. Now it's applicable, which the right there, your therapy's the efficacy of your therapy has just been elevated.
absolutely.
I mean, wow, let's
I
rise.
know, it's amazing, right?
Well, we could talk about this forever. Before we go, I know we've got to kind of start to wrap it up. I want to say that we put in the chat the link to your book. But we were talking about, can I give the link? I know you gave it to me for the Facebook page. Do you want to talk about that
Absolutely.
while I look for that link?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I saw another question, is RTI and MTSS the same thing? Closely related, but a little different. But what I want to do is invite you, if you're interested, to join my Facebook group. One time I was talking to a group of SLPs, and we were kind of like today. We felt like we just didn't want the conversation to end. There was so much more to talk about. And as a result, I said, why don't I form just a little Facebook group and we can keep having this conversation? Now, more than just a few people have joined it, but I always am welcoming more. And it's just a space for SLPs to come together and really talk about their successes, their questions, their challenges related to MTSS. And I formed it and moderate it. And so I try to really keep a close eye on it and answer any questions that people have. There's a lot of people in that group that are really passionate, though, about their roles in SLP and MTSS, can sometimes answer questions even faster than me, give examples for real life things that they're doing. And so I certainly invite you to join. Sometimes when I see a lot of questions around the same thing, I'll invite a guest to come and do like a live Facebook group. There's no CEs or anything. It's very casual, but I'll try to like have a discussion. For example, there was a lot of questions about, universal screening and what screener should I use. And so I invited Suzanne Adloff and a few other guests, and we came and we talked about universal screening. Jennifer Taps Richard visited once and talked about doing short-term speech language support groups, right? Articulation groups, like I was mentioning. She talked about the speech improvement class. So if there's a lot of questions on a certain topic, sometimes we just get together and talk. But certainly bring any questions that you have. And I'm really, all the research that I do and the writing and the work that I do, this is the topic that I'm most excited about. And I love to hear from individual SLPs about their experiences. I've loved even seeing everything that's here in the chat. So
I know this has
if you
been
want to keep the
fabulous.
conversation going, just come and join me. And I'm happy to hear from you anytime, honestly.
Thank you so much, Lesley. And I put the link to the Facebook for everybody. Absolutely. Thank you so much. My children are waving. Hello, hello.
Hello.
All right. I cannot believe we have to say goodbye. We thank you everyone that's been with us today. This has been amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody's so happy. And Lesley, I can't wait to talk to you again. We'll figure out something else, or we'll have you come back when second edition's out and we could talk about updates.
I would love, we didn't get to talk about AAC and MTSS today, which is one of my favorite new topics, because you think about those topics as not being related, but they're so closely related. So I'd love to do that. Thank you for having me back. As much as I like to talk about the pandemic, which is what I talked about last time, I love to talk about MTSS even more. So
this has been great, and I'm going to hold you to it. We're going to bring you back, and we're going to do MTSS and AAC.
That sounds
all right,
amazing.
we'll do it.
I love it.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. We got to say goodbye. I hate it.
It's a great group. Thank you for all your comments. I hope to see some of you later.
Absolutely. I hope to see everybody in our next episode of School of Speech. Thanks for joining us. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.